Beijing's empire isn't built on factories, not on AI labs in Shenzhen, not on cargo ships rounding Singapore, not on the rare earths buried under Inner Mongolia. It's built on one nation the Western press spent 2 decades dismissing as a backwater theocracy. Take that nation off the board, and the structure China assembled over 30 years, the pipelines, the port cities, the secret yuan settlements, the land corridors that bypass the US Navy entirely, folds inward like wet cardboard. That nation is Iran. And here's what almost nobody says out loud, not in the State Department, not on CNBC, not in most Belt and Road analyses. Beijing already knows. They knew in 2021 when they bet $400 billion on a regime visibly bleeding from every artery. They are still doubling down. The reason is the most dangerous open secret in global finance. And once you see it, you cannot unsee how exposed China actually is. The 2021 deal everyone heard about, and almost nobody actually read, runs 18 pages and is signed in 2 languages. The number that leaked, $400 billion of Chinese investment over 25 years, buys China something that sounds boring on the surface and is anything but. Guaranteed crude oil at a discount of roughly a quarter below market for a quarter of a century. Settled in yuan. Read that last word again. Yuan. For the last 50 years, oil, every barrel of it from Houston to Hamburg to Hormuz, has been priced and paid for in dollars. That single arrangement is what props up American interest rates, American debt, and American sanctions power. Every nation on Earth has to keep a reserve of dollars sitting somewhere just to buy fuel, which means every nation on Earth is, in a quiet and continuous way, paying tribute to the Federal Reserve. Iran broke that chain. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, not really. Iran was the first major exporter to sell crude in yuan at scale and accept it as final settlement. No dollar leg, no swift detour. In March of 2018, the Shanghai International Energy Exchange launched a yuan-denominated oil futures contract. The Western press treated it as a curiosity. By 2024, the volume settled in yuan through that exchange, and through CIPS, Beijing's quiet rival to SWIFT, was running at hundreds of billions a year. The single largest stream feeding it was Iranian. When BRICS Plus formally admitted Iran in January 2024, the press treated it as ceremonial. It wasn't. It was the legal scaffolding for a yuan-settled energy bloc that needed Tehran inside the room to function. So the $400 billion number isn't really an investment figure. It's the cost of the only laboratory on Earth where Beijing can run its de-dollarization experiment in live conditions on real volume, between 1.4 and 1.7 million barrels a day, according to tanker tracking firms like Vortexa and Kepler, and watch what happens when the dollar isn't in the room. If Iran falls, that lab gets seized. Whoever holds Tehran next holds the only proof of concept Beijing has that an alternative reserve currency can actually function under stress. No Iran, no petroyuan, no real challenge to American monetary power for at least another generation. That's the first wire. There are 5 more. To see why Beijing is in this position, why the entire shape of Chinese global strategy hangs on a single foreign capital they don't control, it helps to look at the last empire that made the same bet. In 1515, a Portuguese fleet under Afonso de Albuquerque seized a small island at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Hormuz, sandstone, salt, almost no fresh water, seabirds. To the merchants back in Lisbon, it looked like nothing. It was everything. For the next 107 years, every ship carrying spice, silk, indigo, or silver between Asia and Europe paid a tax to Portugal at that one choke point. Lisbon, a city of 40,000 people on the western edge of nowhere, became the financial capital of the planet. They built churches out of Brazilian gold and Indian pepper. They minted coins at a velocity that warped European prices for a century. The empire stretched from Mozambique to Macau, and on a 1600 map it looked permanent. It rested on a single rock. In 1622, a combined Persian and English fleet pried that rock out of Portuguese hands. The empire continued on paper for another 2 centuries. The colonies kept their flags. The bureaucrats kept stamping. But the financial gravity had already shifted to Amsterdam, then to London, and Portugal began the long, slow descent into the small, pleasant European country it is today. The lesson the Portuguese paid for in blood is the lesson nobody seems to teach in business schools. Empires don't collapse where they look strongest. They collapse at the choke point nobody else thought mattered. For the British, that choke point turned out to be Suez in 1956. The day Eisenhower forced them to back down from Nasser, the Royal Navy stopped being a global navy. The empire was finished. even though most British citizens didn't realise it for another decade. For modern China, the chokepoint is Tehran. Every map you've ever seen of the Belt and Road shows it as a network, lines spreading out from China like veins reaching every continent. That image is a kind of strategic camouflage. Strip away the marketing, and the entire Eurasian land project funnels through 3 possible corridors, and only 3. The northern route through Russia has been radioactive since February of 2022. Sanctions, war, no European bank wants the exposure. The southern route, the maritime one, runs through the Strait of Malacca, where the United States Navy could throttle traffic in under 90 minutes if a single order were given. The middle route, the only one Beijing actually controls end-to-end, runs through Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and straight through Iran to the Turkish border and the Mediterranean. It is the single overland artery that lets Chinese cargo reach European markets without crossing a body of water any American admiral cares about. Without Iran, that corridor is geographically impossible. Look at a relief map, there is no other way. The Caucasus is too mountainous, too narrow, too politically combustible. Afghanistan has no usable rail, and probably won't for 50 years. The Iranian plateau is the bridge, and there is no spare bridge in the warehouse. In 2024, the first commercial freight train ran a Xi'an to Tehran loop in 15 days, a vessel making the equivalent journey through the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Suez Canal, and the Mediterranean takes between 35 and 45, cut transit time in half, cut maritime insurance premiums by 60%, remove the US Navy from the equation entirely. That is the Iranian bridge. That is what Beijing is protecting. This is also why the most expensive single Chinese infrastructure project outside of China itself isn't in Africa or Latin America. It's the port of Gwadar in Pakistan, hugging the Iranian border. Gwadar is supposed to be Chabahar's twin, the western anchor of the corridor. And here's the bitter irony nobody in Washington talks about. India has spent the last decade pouring capital into Chabahar, only 40 miles from Gwadar on the Iranian side of the border, explicitly as a counterbet. New Delhi understands the same map Beijing does. Whoever controls the Iranian coast controls the entire western flank of Eurasian trade. Without an Iran that's at minimum non-hostile to China, Gwadar becomes a several billion-dollar dock leading nowhere, and Chabahar becomes the alternative every Indian, European and American shipper would rather use. The whole western half of Belt and Road is built on the assumption that Iran stays inside Beijing's tent. Now here is the part that should have made every front page in the world and somehow didn't. In June of 2024, a container ship chartered by a Chinese state-owned firm, hauling lithium-ion battery components from Shanghai bound for Hamburg, was redirected mid-voyage. Its original route was through the Suez Canal. The Houthis, armed with Iranian-supplied missiles and drones, had made the Red Sea functionally uninsurable for that month. War risk premiums on Suez transits had quadrupled since November of 2023. The ship turned around. It went the long way, around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 14 days and roughly $2 million to the cost of that single voyage. Multiply that by the 11,000 container vessels that move annually between Asia and Europe, and the second-order math gets ugly fast. Maersk alone reported a 40% capacity squeeze on the Asia-Europe route in the first half of 2024. Now ask the uncomfortable question. Who actually benefits when the sea route between Asia and Europe becomes unaffordable? The land route does, through Iran. For 2 decades, Western policy papers have told a story about Iran's missile and drone program. It's about Israel. It's about regional theology. It's about Shia ambitions. Some of that is true, but there is a layer underneath the surface story almost nobody in Washington admits in public. Every Iranian missile that closes a sea lane increases the relative value of the land route through Iran. Every Houthi attack on a tanker in the Bab el-Mandeb makes the Khorgos Gateway dry port on the Kazakh-Chinese border a little more profitable. Every American carrier strike group that has to be repositioned to babysit the Red Sea is one less carrier group near Taiwan. Every shipping CEO who decides the Cape route is too slow ends up sending a freight train through the Iranian plateau instead. You can call that coincidence if you want. Beijing isn't calling it a coincidence. The Iranians aren't calling it a coincidence either. It is, almost certainly, the unspoken price of admission for the 2021 deal that Tehran's regional disruption agenda will, at minimum, be aimed in directions that don't hurt Chinese interests. If you want to see how deep the dependency runs, look at the Shandong coast. Chinese refineries clustered there, known in the trade as teapots, small, privately registered, politically deniable, process between 30 and 40% of all the crude oil that enters mainland China. The official customs statistics say almost none of that crude comes from Iran. The official customs statistics are a polite fiction designed for diplomatic deniability. Tanker AIS data, the radio signals every legal vessel is required to broadcast, tells the real story. A very large crude carrier leaves Karg Island in the northern Persian Gulf. Halfway through the voyage, somewhere off the coast of Oman or in the deep water near Singapore, the transponder goes dark. For 3 to 5 days, the ship doesn't exist on any global tracking system. When the signal comes back on, the same vessel is now flagged as Malaysian, Singaporean, or Omani. The cargo, under any forensic test, is Iranian crude. The paperwork, bills of lading, certificates of origin, sale contracts, says it isn't. This is the so-called shadow fleet. As of late 2024, satellite analysts at firms like Tanker Trackers and Vortexa identified more than 400 vessels operating in this grey space, almost all of them moving Iranian and Russian oil into Chinese refineries. The discount on this crude, the price Chinese refiners actually pay versus the going Brent benchmark, has averaged between $12 and $22 a barrel for most of the last 3 years. Run the math. Roughly 1.5 million barrels per day, times an average discount of $17 a barrel, times 365 days. That works out to a hidden annual subsidy of around $9 to $12 billion flowing into Chinese industry every year in energy savings nobody else can access. That subsidy is one of the unspoken reasons a Chinese-built electric vehicle can land in Rotterdam at a price German automakers cannot match without going bankrupt. It isn't only labour costs. It isn't only scale, it isn't only state subsidy programs. A meaningful slice of the cost gap is an Iranian discount Beijing extracts, because no other major economy is willing to violate Western sanctions at industrial scale. If the regime in Tehran shifts, if a friendlier Iran reopens to Western capital, prices its oil at full market, and settles in dollars again, that subsidy evaporates almost overnight. The cost structure of large parts of Chinese export manufacturing partially collapses with it, and once that becomes visible in the quarterly earnings of European competitors, the political case for tariffs against China loses much of its current asymmetry. Now here is where this stops looking like a clean strategic play and starts looking like a trap with very deep walls. You cannot run a quiet retreat from a relationship like this. The investments are too physical, too visible, too literally cemented into the ground. CNPC holds a roughly 30% stake in the North Pas gas field. Sinopec sank close to $2 billion into the Yadavaran oil field in Khuzestan. Chinese contractors built the Tehran metro extensions. Chinese steel built the rail connection from the Iranian interior to the Turkmen border. Chinese capital is buried under 1,000 kilometers of pipe. These aren't diplomatic gestures, they're concrete. Steel. Once you've welded a pipeline across 2 countries, you cannot unweld it because the politics shifted. Which means Beijing now sits in a position the Politburo's strategy papers almost never spell out loud. They're obligated to defend a regime they did not choose, in a region they cannot dominate, against threats they cannot directly deter. Recall what happened in March of 2023, when China brokered the Saudi-Iran reconciliation in Beijing. The Western press treated it as a triumph of Chinese diplomacy. It was, but it was also a panic move. The agreement was a hedge. If Riyadh and Tehran were quietly talking, there was less risk of a Saudi-led military coalition rolling into Iran with American air cover. Beijing wasn't projecting power that day. Beijing was buying insurance against its own balance sheet imploding. And insurance is what you buy when you're afraid of losing something specific. There is a historical echo here that almost nobody in Western foreign policy circles still remembers. In World War II, the Allies built what was then called the Persian Corridor, the Trans-Iranian Railway, expanded with American and British engineers that delivered roughly 30% of all Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945. Iran decided who won that war by being the corridor. Stalin's industry didn't survive on Russian factories alone. It survived because supplies could move through Iran, around the U-boat blockades. Iran has been the corridor before. Last time, it determined the outcome of a global war. Beijing has read those history books. The question is whether the men who currently run Iran have read them too, and what conclusions they're drawing about how much that corridor is now worth. Now picture the specific scenario Beijing actually loses sleep over. It isn't open war. War is the obvious risk, the one you can plan for. The unobvious risk is worse. Iran's regime doesn't fall to American bombs, it falls to internal pressure. Currency collapse. The rial has lost more than 95% of its value against the dollar over the last decade. Water shortages so severe that entire cities in the country's interior are running out of usable groundwater. Generational fatigue, especially among the under-30 population, who watched the 2022 protests get crushed and concluded the system cannot reform itself. A succession crisis after Khamenei, who is now in his late 80s. The new leadership, whoever they turn out to be, looks at the math. They see that Chinese investment delivered roads and refineries, but didn't deliver the one thing Iran actually needed most: access to the global financial system, access to Western technology, access to a normal economy. They see that aligning with Beijing made them a discount oil supplier rather than a strategic partner. They see that the $400 billion deal, in actual deployed capital, has delivered closer to $30 billion in 8 years, about a quarter of what was promised. A data's tracker on Chinese overseas lending shows that pattern repeating across nearly every Belt and Road country. Announced figures balloon for the cameras, dispersed figures stay quiet. So they pivot, not dramatically, no flag burning, no public renunciation, a series of quiet announcements over 6 months, a normalization track with Washington, an end to yuan-only oil settlements, a reopening of the upstream fields to Total, BP, Shell and ExxonMobil, a renegotiation of every Chinese contract under new conditions. Within 12 months, the structural picture changes completely. Iranian oil flows back into the dollar market at full price. The yuan settlement experiment loses its only major laboratory. Chinese refiners on the Shandong coast lose their $17 a barrel discount and have to absorb roughly $25 billion in additional energy costs annually. The land bridge through Iran becomes politically negotiable rather than strategically guaranteed, meaning every shipment now pays a transit tariff that wasn't there before, and the Belt and Road, marketed for a decade as the inevitable shape of the 21st century, suddenly looks like what skeptics warned it always was, an enormous loan portfolio collateralized by hope. So when American analysts argue about whether the next century belongs to Beijing or to Washington, they're asking the wrong question. The answer doesn't live in Shanghai or in Silicon Valley. It doesn't live in semiconductor fabs or shipyards. It lives in Tehran. If the regime there holds, China gets to run its parallel financial system, defend its land corridor, and quietly subsidize its industry on Iranian crude for another decade. The fragility never gets stress-tested. The empire continues to look inevitable. If it falls, or worse, pivots westward without violence, the entire architecture starts to come apart at the exact seam Beijing cannot reinforce. China cannot send a fleet to defend Tehran. They cannot install a more loyal regime by force. They cannot relocate the Strait of Hormuz. They are, for the first time since 1949, hostages to a foreign government's domestic politics. Which brings us back to the Portuguese. When that combined fleet pried Hormuz away from Lisbon in 1622, no Portuguese citizen woke up the next morning thinking the empire was over. The bureaucrats kept stamping. The map still showed pink. The cathedrals were still being finished. The collapse came slowly enough that the people inside it could not feel it happening. Something similar is unfolding around Beijing right now. The signs are not in headlines. They're in shipping contracts, in tanker transponders going dark off the coast of Oman, in 18-page documents written in 2 languages, in the quiet mathematics of who controls the chokepoint between East and West. Most people watching China rise will keep watching the surface, the trade war, the chip restrictions, the Taiwan analysis, and miss the actual hinge. The pillar holding up the building is in a country most of them couldn't find on a map without help. You won't make that mistake again. If videos that strip the polite layer off geopolitics are what your brain is here for, the subscribe button is 1 click away. There is more under the surface. Most of it is uglier than the headline.